Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're embarking on what I think is a really crucial exploration. We're looking into this incredibly complex and honestly rapidly evolving global landscape.
Yeah, it's moving fast.
We're talking about these highly interconnected conflicts,
Yeah.
involving Iran, Israel, Russia, and Ukraine. It's a lot.
It really is. It feels like a global chessboard, doesn't it? Where every single move, even a small one, seems to create these surprising, often immediate ripple effects right across the world.
Absolutely. And that's our mission today, really, to try and quickly unpack these latest developments, understand some of those, well, sometimes truly surprising ripple effects,
Yeah.
and explore what a potential U.S.-Iran conflict, if it comes to that, could actually mean for the global stage.
It's a big question.
It is. Now, for this deep dive, we've synthesized a wealth of insights. We've been digging into recent YouTube transcripts that provide some really detailed analysis, along with reports from major international news outlets.
Done.
The usual suspects like the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the Financial Times, and also Ukrainian Pravda.
Good sources. Solid stuff.
Right. And our aim, as always, is to distill this factual content, just boil it down to give you the clearest, most concise picture possible of what's actually going on.
Cutting through the noise. Right.
Exactly. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's unpack this. We're starting with an insight that might seem a bit counterintuitive at first glance.
Okay.
The idea is, if the United States were to actually engage in a full-blown war with Iran, looking at the bigger picture, that whole scenario, it actually appears to favor Russia.
Right. Favor Russia and disadvantage Ukraine significantly.
Precisely.
And what's really crucial to understand here, I think, is that this isn't, us making a judgment call on whether that decision is right or wrong.
Not at all.
It's more about highlighting these deep, often sort of unseen connections between these global conflicts. It's all profoundly intertwined, and resources, attention, they're finite. They have to come from somewhere.
You've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. It's finite. And, I mean, we're even seeing observations coming from within Russia itself.
Oh, interesting. Where from?
Specifically from the, well, somewhat infamous neo-Nazi Rosich group. They're a far-right paramilitary unit. And look, their critiques, surprisingly, can sometimes offer these really candid insights into Russian military shortfalls. They don't hold back.
Okay, so even elements like that are weighing in. What are they saying?
Well, they've been expressing significant frustration, almost asking out loud, why is Israel able to achieve certain objectives seemingly with much more effectiveness while Russia struggles so much in Ukraine?
Wow. That's quite a moment of self-reflection coming from a group like that, acknowledging their own side's struggles compared to Israel.
It really is. And this naturally raises an important question about air superiority, doesn't it?
It does. How do they compare the two?
They've drawn this really stark contrast. On one hand, you have Israel's perceived air supremacy over parts of Iran. Now, we need to be clear here. There's only one confirmed aerial shootdown of an Iranian Hermes drone that we know of.
Right, despite Iranian claims.
Exactly. Iran's claims of downing F-35s are, well, widely discredited. There's evidence suggesting they used manipulated AI images for that.
Okay, so standard propaganda tactics there.
Pretty much. But compare that perception of Israeli air power, even with the propaganda, to Russia's persistent, ongoing lack of air superiority in Ukraine. It's night and day.
Yeah, that's a battle Russia just hasn't been able to win definitively despite years of trying.
And the Rosich Group's point, it really holds weight when you look at the actual facts on the ground. Russia has very real documented issues in the air.
Like what, specifically?
Well, just recently we saw footage surface of a Russian aircraft shooting down another Russian jet, a friendly fire incident.
Oof, that's not good. Speaks to coordination issues, maybe training?
Absolutely. It's a concerning sign of internal disarray, potentially inadequate training, poor coordination, maybe all of the above. And just weeks before that, Ukrainian drones managed to take out strategic aviation assets on Russian airfields deep inside Russia.
So Ukraine is hitting valuable targets far behind the lines.
Correct. And think about this. For years now, Russian aircraft have rarely, if ever, crossed the actual line of contact in Ukraine. They rely heavily on glide bombs.
Right, launched from a distance.
Precisely so they don't have to get close, because they fear being shot down by Ukrainian air defenses. It's a remarkably different operational reality compared to how Israel appears to be operating, or at least how this Russian group perceives Israel operating.
A very cautious approach from the Russian Air Force, born out of necessity, it seems.
Exactly. And their observations, the Rusich groups, they extend beyond just air power.
Okay, what else did they point out?
They highlighted Israel's reported success. Again, this is based on reports in eliminating somewhere between 20 to 30 senior Iranian leaders right in the opening hours of the recent escalation.
A significant decapitation strike, if accurate.
Yeah. And they contrast that sharply with Russia's apparent inability to effectively strike Ukraine's so-called decision-making center or eliminate its military political administration even back in the initial stages of the full-scale invasion.
That was a key Russian objective early on, wasn't it? Targeting Kiev, targeting leadership, and it largely failed.
It largely failed. So that's a pretty damning comparison coming from within their own, broader sphere, isn't it?
It really is. It cuts deep, you'd imagine.
Then consider air defenses. This was another point they made. They noted that Israeli air defenses, like Iron Dome and others, reportedly repelled hundreds of missiles and drones launched by Iran, with apparently only a few actually reaching their targets.
A very high interception rate, by all accounts.
Very high. Now compare that, as the Rusich group does, to Russian air defenses, which they sort of cynically claim are allowing light-engine crop duster aircraft to pass through.
Okay, that sounds like a reference to those drone incidents, maybe even the one that landed near the Kremlin years ago.
Could be. Or other smaller drone incursions. Now look, to be fair, we have to acknowledge Russia has a vastly larger border to defend. It's a significantly larger area than Israel.
True, that's an important caveat. Scale matters.
It does. But the comparison, even with that caveat, still paints a very different picture of perceived effectiveness, at least in the eyes of these Russian commentators.
Yeah, the optics are certainly different.
Another intriguing aspect of their commentary is how they perceive the different intelligence agencies.
Ah, the spies. Always fascinating.
Right. They contend that Israeli intelligence, Mossad, basically acts as if they were at home, inside Iran. They point to successful sabotage operations happening behind enemy lines, the use of collaborators. Essentially, a very active, very embedded presence.
Which aligns with Mossad's reputation, I suppose. Feared for their reach.
It does. And this is contrasted, in the Rusich view, with what they describe as virtually no activity of Russian special services in Ukraine, at least not to a comparable extent in terms of sabotage or deep penetration behind enemy lines.
That's interesting. Because you'd assume Russian intelligence would have deep historical ties and networks in Ukraine. But perhaps they haven't been as effective as expected, or as effective as Mossad is perceived to be in Iran.
That seems to be their assessment. And it doesn't stop there. It extends to information warfare, too.
How so?
Israel has reportedly managed to strike Iranian TV channels, disrupting their broadcasts. Yet Russia, despite its efforts, has been unable to consistently halt Ukrainian television broadcasts across Ukraine.
Another area where the comparison doesn't flatter the Russian effort, according to this group?
Not at all. And all of this, the air superiority issues, the targeting failures, the air defense comparisons, the intelligence gaps, the InfoWar struggles, it all leads to this rather cynical, almost bleak observation from the Rusich group. They basically say, it turns out a full-scale war means throwing freshly mobilized meat at the front in huge quantities, and not with technology.
Wow. That's incredibly harsh. A direct critique of their own side's strategy, essentially saying it's reliant on manpower over modern warfare techniques.
It's about as harsh an assessment as you can get, especially coming from a group like that, which you'd normally expect to be rah-rah nationalist.
It really is. It paints a very stark difference in how these two major nation versus nation conflicts are playing out, or at least how they're being perceived internally. And it's quite telling, isn't it, to see elements within Russia openly questioning their own military's capabilities like this.
Extremely telling. So, okay, bring it back. What does this all practically mean for Russia and Ukraine if the U.S. does go to war with Iran?
Right, the ripple effects.
For Russia, as we touched on, the direct military impact on their own capabilities in Ukraine would likely be minimal.
Yeah, their army won't suddenly get weaker because of fighting in Iran.
Exactly. What we'd probably see is a reduction in the direct mutual support between Iran and Russia. Both would be, pretty preoccupied with their own fights.
Makes sense. Less bandwidth for each other.
But, and this is a key point, this probably isn't going to significantly impact Russia's drone campaign against Ukraine. Why? Because most of the Shahed-style drones, or Geran drones as Russia calls them, that Russia fires daily, are now reportedly domestically produced within Russia itself.
Ah, so they've localized production. The Iranian supply line isn't as critical as it once was for the day-to-day attacks.
Correct. So even if that Iranian supply pipeline were to shut off entirely, you probably wouldn't see a drastic change in the daily volume of drones hitting Ukraine. And conversely,
Don't expect Russia to ride to Iran's rescue in a big way.
precisely, don't expect Russia to be able to offer significant military aid to Iran, given their own ongoing war in Ukraine and, frankly, their strained resources. They're stretched thin as it is.
Okay, so minimal direct impact on Russia's war machine, maybe some reduced cooperation. What about Ukraine?
Well, for Ukraine, the bottom line looks like a significant negative impact.
Okay, why is that?
It largely boils down to one thing: the diversion of U.S. assets and, crucially, attention.
Resources and focus shifting away.
Exactly. And we've already seen tangible evidence of this happening. Just, a week or two ago, there were confirmed reports that anti-drone rockets interceptors that were specifically purchased for Ukraine to help them shoot down those Iranian-supplied Shaheds.
Yeah, what happened to them?
They were reallocated, diverted to U.S. forces operating in the Middle East to counter threats there.
Wow. So weapons literally bought for Ukraine are now being sent elsewhere because of the Iran situation.
That's right. And that was really a critical leading indicator, a sign of things to come. Since then, we've seen this massive U.S. military surge into the region.
What kind of surge are we talking about?
Another carrier strike grouping deployed, more refueling aircraft, additional air defense batteries, Patriot systems potentially, and a significant number of additional aircraft being moved into theater.
That's a major commitment of high-value assets.
It is, yeah. And it really feels like the entire focus, the attention bandwidth of the U.S. government right now has dramatically shifted towards Israel and Iran. And inevitably, that draws attention away from Russia and Ukraine.
Out of sight, out of mind to some extent, or at least not the top priority anymore?
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Senator Lindsey Graham, who's usually very focused on supporting Ukraine, really articulated this point quite starkly. He basically said Iran is center stage right now.
Okay.
He added that while they haven't forgotten about Russia and Ukraine, a significant sanctions package, one targeting Russia and aimed at helping Ukraine, which was apparently on the verge of being put forward for a vote, is now effectively on hold.
So direct policy consequences already, the legislative agenda is shifting too.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you look at all this, and Ukraine's best case scenario here, if you can even call it that, is really if Israel manages to handle this conflict largely on their own without requiring a massive sustained U.S. intervention.
Which theoretically might then free up U.S. resources and attention to swing back towards Ukraine in the longer term.
Maybe, potentially. But that, as you can imagine, is a very, very big if right now. There are no guarantees.
A precarious position for Ukraine, depending heavily on events thousands of miles away.
Incredibly precarious. Now, let's pivot a bit and talk about Iran's striking strategy in this recent escalation, because here's where things get genuinely concerning.
Okay, what are we saying?
There's a growing body of evidence based on analyses of their targets, suggesting that Iran's current strategy appears to be the deliberate targeting of Israeli civilians, rather than focusing primarily on degrading Israel's military capabilities.
That's a significant claim. Deliberate civilian targeting is a war crime. Are we sure about this?
Well, it's a significant claim, and maybe not where many might have expected this conflict to escalate, certainly not this early. But if we objectively analyze the observed patterns, the types of targets being hit, it does seem to point in this direction.
So what's the evidence?
Iran appears to be using its limited supply of relatively precise ballistic missiles, not to hit, say, Israeli airfields or military bases in open areas, but to target what they describe as secret Israeli military bases located within civilian city centers.
Hitting alleged military targets embedded in urban areas, that's always legally and morally fraught.
Exactly. And crucially, they seem to be prioritizing these alleged urban targets over hitting, for instance, those crucial Israeli airfields that are demonstrably hosting the aircraft, causing significant damage to Iranian resources and proxies day after day.
That does seem to defy conventional military logic, doesn't it? Why wouldn't you prioritize neutralizing the immediate threat the airbase is launching strikes against you?
It really does. I mean, a prime example everyone's been talking about is the ballistic missile strike on Soroka Hospital in Beersheba.
Right, I saw reports about that major hospital.
Exactly. The IDF, Israel's defense forces, have claimed this proves Iran targets civilians, while Israel insists it only targets military objectives. The hospital director actually confirmed that a missile hit an old surgical ward building.
Okay, was anyone hurt?
Thankfully, that specific building had already been evacuated, so no casualties in that direct hit. But the director did report damage to other hospital buildings, primarily from the blast shockwaves, so a hospital complex was definitely impacted.
Okay. Still incredibly dangerous hitting near a functioning hospital. What was Iran's explanation for that? This is where it gets murky, right?
Extremely murky. What's particularly illuminating, or perhaps confusing, are the conflicting Iranian narratives that emerged almost immediately after the strike. We observed at least 3 distinct, totally contradictory versions circulating in Iranian state and semi-state media.
3 different stories
Yeah.
about hitting a hospital. Okay, let's hear them.
Version 1. They circulated what appeared to be AI-generated footage, fake footage, claiming that Israeli military tanks were secretly parked underneath the hospital.
Ah, the human shield argument using fabricated evidence.
Precisely. The implication being, see, it was a valid military target after all. Version 2. They shifted slightly, claiming they hadn't aimed for the hospital itself, but rather a secret intelligence and communications building next door.
Okay.
And in this version, the damage to the hospital was supposedly just unintentional collateral damage from the shockwaves.
Convenient. Damage just happened to hit the hospital.
Very convenient. And then, version 3. Incredibly titty. Some Iranian media outlets actually admitted hitting the hospital structure itself.
They admitted it.
Yes, but they still maintained it wasn't really a hospital, but a secret communications base operating inside the hospital building.
So 3 completely different justifications for the same event. That doesn't exactly scream credibility, does it?
Not remotely.
Yeah.
You really have to question the entire narrative when you're getting 3 different official or semi-official stories simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And adding to the confusion, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had previously issued statements saying they would ramp up attacks specifically against military targets. Hitting a hospital or claiming it's a secret base doesn't really align with that stated intention.
No, it doesn't align at all. It seems to contradict their own declared policy. So from a purely military strategy perspective, it still feels illogical.
Exactly. Why would you, from a military standpoint, expend your valuable precision-guided ballistic missiles, which Iran doesn't have an unlimited supply of, hitting these supposed secret intelligence and operations buildings right in the middle of densely populated city centers?
While leaving known crucial Israeli airfields relatively untouched. Airfields that are actively launching sorties damaging your own assets and allies every single day.
It just doesn't add up, militarily speaking.
It's a
It's like if someone robbed your house, right? Your house is actively being robbed.
Yeah.
And your immediate top priority response is not to call the police or defend yourself, but to log onto your computer and try to lock the robber out of their online banking account.
Huh. Okay, I see the analogy. It might cause them some inconvenience down the road, maybe.
Maybe. But in the meantime, you've got a much more immediate, much more existential problem right there in your living room that you're not dealing with.
Right. You're focusing on a secondary, less critical target instead of the primary threat.
Precisely. And this contrasts so sharply with Israel's initial response in past conflicts, or even this one. Their targeting generally seems much more militarily logical. They typically go after air defenses first, then missile launchers, command and control centers, things that directly impact the enemy's ability to fight back effectively now.
Yeah, that follows standard military doctrine for degrading enemy capabilities. Iran's approach here seems different, more focused on psychological impact, perhaps, or just poor targeting.
It's hard to say definitively, but the pattern of targeting civilian areas or alleged targets within them, combined with things like the hospital strike, certainly raises serious questions about intent. And then there's another piece of this puzzle, the use of cluster munitions.
Ah, yes.
Right.
There were reports about that, too. Has that been confirmed?
Yes, we now have confirmed reports that Iran used ballistic missiles carrying cluster warheads in some of their strikes against Israel.
Can you explain how those work again?
Sure. The basic mechanism is that the main ballistic missile warhead splits open at a relatively high altitude, maybe around 7 kilometers, something like that. It then releases numerous smaller munitions, sometimes called submunitions or bomblets.
Okay.
In the reported cases, it seems like maybe 20 or so smaller munitions were spread out over a pretty wide area, potentially an 8-kilometer radius. We know one of these submunitions, for example, hit a private home in the town of Azor, causing damage.
So it blankets a large area with smaller explosions.
Exactly. You get more individual points of impact, more explosives distributed over a wider footprint, although the individual explosions from each submunition are obviously smaller than one large warhead.
Now, cluster munitions are controversial, but they do have legitimate military uses, right?
Absolutely. It's important to acknowledge that. They can be very effective in certain military contexts. for example, against infantry formations caught in the open, or against convoys of lightly armored vehicles.
Or airfields, maybe, to damage runways or parked aircraft.
Yes, exactly. Ukraine, for instance, has reportedly used cluster munitions provided by the U.S. very effectively against Russian troop concentrations and even against Russian airfields, like in occupied Crimea, to damage aircraft and infrastructure over a wide area. That's a recognized military application.
Okay, so what's the issue with Iran using them against Israel then?
Here's the crucial distinction. While there are legitimate military uses in open areas or against specific military targets like airfields, there is almost no rational military excuse for using cluster munitions in or near population centers,
Why not?
because they are inherently indiscriminate weapons, especially when delivered by ballistic missile over long distances. You simply cannot choose or predict exactly where any one of those dozens of smaller clusters, those bomblets, will land once they're released. They spread out over a huge area.
So firing them towards a city pretty much guarantees civilian casualties and damage to civilian property?
Almost inevitably, yes. Using them in such a context strongly indicates a focus not on achieving precise military targeting, but rather on terrorizing a larger population, spreading fear, and disrupting civilian life over a wide area. It aligns again with a strategy that seems aimed at eroding domestic morale and support through widespread fear, rather than purely degrading military capability.
Okay, so the choice of targets and the choice of weapons seem to point towards a strategy with a significant focus on impacting civilians.
That's what the pattern suggests, yes. A very worrying trend. So, given this escalating situation, the seemingly deliberate targeting of civilian areas, how has Israel been responding militarily?
Well, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have reported conducting significant counterstrikes. In their most recent major wave of operations, they stated that over 50 Israeli Air Force fighter jets struck dozens of targets across Iran.
50 jets. That's a substantial force package. What kinds of targets were they hitting?
According to the IDF statements, the targets included facilities involved in producing raw materials for missiles, specifically mentioning vehicles used for assembling ballistic missiles. They also targeted sites related to air defense systems, radars, launchers, and missile storage or launch sites themselves.
So, targeting Iran's missile production and launch capability, as well as their defenses, seems militarily logical.
Yes, it aligns with that capability degradation strategy we discussed earlier. They also reported destroying missile launchers that were apparently ready to fire, along with radars and aerial detection systems, in what they termed dynamic targeting, hitting targets of opportunity as they pop up.
And they mentioned intercepting incoming threats, too.
Correct. Alongside their offensive strikes, the IDF also confirmed intercepting 17 UAVs, drones, that were launched from Iran towards Israel during that same period.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier it's hard to get information out of Iran right now.
Yes, that's a significant factor. It's worth noting that we're getting very limited independent footage or detailed information coming out of Iran during these Israeli strikes. There seems to be widespread internet throttling, and in some areas, reports suggest the internet is completely shut down.
So we're largely reliant on official statements from both sides. And satellite imagery, I suppose.
Pretty much. Satellite imagery has been key. And speaking of which, one particularly intriguing Israeli strike confirmed by satellite imagery was the one targeting Iran's Arak heavy water reactor.
AREC. That's a nuclear facility, isn't it? Part of the old deal, the JCPOA.
Exactly. Under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, the core of the Arak reactor, was supposed to be rendered unusable for producing significant amounts of weapons-grade plutonium. The plan was to fill it with concrete.
Right, to prevent them from using that route to a bomb.
Right.
So why did Israel hit it now?
Well, the IDF's justification for the strike was basically that Iran never fully completed that process. They claim Iran didn't fully seal the structure as required, meaning theoretically it could potentially be reactivated someday to produce plutonium. So Israel framed the strike as a preventative measure.
Huh. But wasn't Iraq considered less of a proliferation risk than, say, their uranium enrichment program?
Generally, yes. And interestingly, reports suggest that Iran was actually quite baffled by this specific target choice. Apparently, they don't see Iraq in its current state as a facility capable of producing militarily significant amounts of plutonium anyway. So they were sort of scratching their heads as to why Israel would prioritize hitting it.
Maybe a signal. hitting something related to the nuclear program, even if not the most critical part.
That's certainly one interpretation, a symbolic strike, perhaps. And here's another telling detail about that Iraq strike. Israel reportedly issued warnings beforehand, requesting residents in the vicinity of Iraq, which is about 250 kilometers west of Tehran, to evacuate the area before the strike happened.
Issuing warnings before hitting a nuclear-related site. Okay, this whole nuclear dimension, it just inevitably brings the U.S. deeper into the picture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It leads directly into the debate about U.S. involvement, potential U.S. strikes, and what many consider the ultimate challenge in this whole scenario, the Fordow nuclear facility.
Fordow, right. The one buried deep underground. Has there been any decision from the U.S. side on strikes?
Well, former President Trump has publicly pushed back on reports that a final decision has been made for strikes against Iran. However, he has also publicly stated that he has approved the military plans for potential strikes, should they become necessary. So the plans exist and are apparently greenlit, even if the final order hasn't been given.
Okay, so the option is on the table, plans approved. What's the feeling among the American public about this? Is there support for potential military action?
What's really fascinating here, and quite striking in today's polarized environment, is the strong U.S. public opinion surrounding Iran's nuclear program. Polling consistently shows near universal agreement, something like 79% of American adults across all party lines, that Iran should not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. That's a very high level of consensus.
Okay, so broad agreement on preventing a nuclear Iran, but does that translate into support for military action to stop it?
That's where it gets a bit more nuanced, but still significant. If Iran is perceived to be actively trying to make a nuclear weapon, a slight plurality of Americans overall favor U.S. airstrikes to prevent it. And that support is much higher among Republicans, around 69% favor strikes in that scenario.
So significant, especially Republican, support for intervention if Iran crosses that line.
Yes. And this broad consensus, this willingness to consider military action, is quite unusual in our current political climate. Of course, you also have the counterpressure. There have been active no war with Iran protests happening as well. But the polling suggests a significant portion of the public sees a nuclear Iran as a red line worth enforcing, potentially with force.
Okay, so let's delve into Fordow then. Why is this facility considered the ultimate challenge?
Right, Fordow. It's infamous for a reason. Construction started way back in 1981, though it wasn't fully completed until around 2006. Its location is key. It's situated about 90 kilometers southwest of Tehran, and crucially, it's burrowed deep, deep under a rocky mountain.
Built into a mountain. Why?
It was initially designed, quite explicitly, to protect Iran's nuclear program from exactly this kind of scenario, potential enemy airstrikes. They wanted a facility that would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to destroy from the air.
And did it stay secret?
Not forever. Despite the secrecy in the location, it was eventually discovered by U.S. and British intelligence agencies back in 2009. Its existence became public knowledge then.
Okay, so we know it's there, we know it's deep. What's actually inside Fordow? What makes it so dangerous?
What's deeply concerning are its capabilities. Inside that mountain complex, it contains two very large uranium enrichment chambers. These chambers are reportedly capable of holding up to 16,000 centrifuges.
16,000, that's a huge number. Are they advanced centrifuges?
Yes. Reports indicate they include advanced models like the IR-6 centrifuges, which are much more efficient at enriching uranium than older models. And critically, Fordow is known to be capable of enriching uranium up to 60% purity. 60%, which is very close to weapons grade, right? Like technically just a short step away.
Exactly. Weapons grade is typically considered 90% or above, but going from 60% to 90% is technologically much faster and easier than going from, say, reactor grade, 3 to 5%, up to 60%. So 60% enrichment is a major threshold and a serious proliferation concern. And all this is protected how deep? You said deep, but how deep?
Reports vary slightly, but the commonly cited figure is that the crucial parts of the facility are buried approximately 90 meters. That's nearly 300 feet beneath solid rock and reinforced concrete. It's also protected by what are described as giant steel concrete walls internally. It's a fortress.
90 meters. Okay, so here's the obvious striking dilemma. How do you destroy something buried that deep? Israel presumably doesn't have the capability.
Correct. Israel's current bunker buster bombs, like the U.S.-supplied GBU-28 or the Israeli-made Blue 109, are simply insufficient for a target like Fordow. They can penetrate maybe 1 or 2 meters of reinforced concrete, perhaps a bit more of rock, but nowhere near the 90 meters needed to reach the enrichment halls at Fordow.
So Israel can't do it alone with conventional bombs.
Not against Fordow, no. They also lack the necessary delivery platform for the truly massive conventional bunker busters. They don't operate the B-2 stealth bomber, which is typically required to deliver the heaviest penetrating munitions in the U.S. arsenal.
Which helps explain why, in the past, there was focus on other methods,
Mm-mm.
like intelligence operations or cyber attacks, right? Like the Stuxnet virus, the Olympic Games operation.
Exactly. Those were attempts to slow down or sabotage the program non-kinetically, partly because kinetic options against hardened targets like Fordow are so difficult, especially for Israel acting alone.
Okay, so if Israel can't do it, what's the U.S. solution for Fordow if they decided they had to take it out?
This is where we get into the really heavy hardware. According to reports, particularly in The Guardian and the Financial Times, citing U.S. military planning documents, the primary proposed conventional weapon is the GBU-57B Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP.
The MOP, I've heard of that. That's the giant one, right?
That's the one. It's an absolute beast. It weighs 13.5 tons, that's 30,000 pounds, and carries about 2,500 kilograms, over 5,000 pounds, of high explosives. It's specifically designed to penetrate deeply buried, hardened targets.
Okay, 13.5 tons. How deep can it penetrate? Can it reach 90 meters?
Here's the problem again. While incredibly powerful, the MOP's stated maximum penetration capability is generally estimated to be around 60 meters or 200 feet of reinforced concrete.
60 meters, but you just said Fordo is 90 meters deep, so even the biggest conventional bunker buster in the U.S. arsenal isn't enough on its own.
Apparently not. 60 meters is impressive, but it still falls short of the estimated depth of the critical enrichment chambers at Fordo by about 30 meters.
So what then? If the MOP can't do it, how does the plan propose to destroy Fordo? This is where it gets really serious, isn't it?
This is where the proposed escalation, reportedly presented to former President Trump as an option, becomes extremely controversial and, frankly, quite alarming. The plan apparently involves not just one MOP, but using multiple GBU-57 MOPs dropped very precisely in sequence onto the same spot.
Multiple hits, like hammering the same nail over and over.
Kind of. The idea is that the first MOP detonates and clears out the initial layers. The second one penetrates deeper through the fractured rock and concrete, and perhaps a third one goes even deeper, aiming to achieve a cumulative penetration depth closer to that 70 or 80 meter mark.
Okay, multiple MOPs to get closer to the target, but still maybe not all the way. What's the final step in this plan?
This is the most critical and potentially world-altering part. The plan reportedly suggests that after the multiple conventional MOP strikes have hopefully penetrated most of the way down, the final step would be to follow up with a low-yield tactical nuclear missile.
A tactical nuke, to finish the job after the conventional bombs clear the path.
That appears to be the concept presented in these plans. The nuclear weapon wouldn't need to penetrate the full 90 meters itself. It would just need to detonate close enough within the cavity created by the MOPs to generate enough explosive force and potentially seismic shock to collapse and destroy the deeply buried enrichment halls.
Wow. Using a nuclear weapon militarily for the first time since 1945.
Exactly. This is where the implications become incredibly profound and dangerous. We need to be clear. This is based on reports of military plans presented as options. But the very fact that such an option exists and has been briefed is significant.
Are there doubts about whether even this multi-stage plan would work?
Yes, there are. A report from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, which specializes in WMD threats, apparently warned that even using multiple MOPs might not be reliably effective. They characterized the idea of a one-and-done conventional strike against such a target as a myth.
So even the conventional part is uncertain.
And they also highlighted another major challenge. Iran possesses sophisticated GPS jamming capabilities. Hitting the exact same spot repeatedly with multiple 13.5-ton bombs from high altitude requires extreme precision. If GPS is jammed or degraded, those bombs could easily miss their intended impact point, rendering the sequential attack ineffective.
So immense technical challenges, immense risks,
Yeah.
and the potential use of a nuclear weapon.
It really raises the stakes to an almost unprecedented level since World War II. The use of a tactical nuclear missile by the U.S. would mark the first military nuclear intervention since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It would cross a major global threshold.
And didn't you mention the U.S. ambassador invoked Truman?
Yes, reportedly, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, in discussing the potential need to stop Iran's nuclear program, publicly invoked President Truman's actions in Japan, the atomic bombings, as a historical precedent for making difficult decisions to prevent a greater threat. It's Very strong language.
Extremely strong language.
Mhm.
And just to reiterate, has Trump given the final go-ahead for this specific nuclear option?
To be absolutely clear, based on current public knowledge and his own statements, no. Former President Trump has not given final approval for that specific extreme measure involving a nuclear weapon. He approved the plans which contain that option, but the final trigger hasn't been pulled, as far as we know.
But the fact that it's even being contemplated at that level,
Hmm.
it sends immediate shockwaves, doesn't it,
Yeah.
across the globe?
Absolutely. The mere discussion of such extreme measures has consequences. Which brings us back to those ripple effects, especially how this escalating situation is being viewed elsewhere, like in Russia, and what it means for Ukraine right now.
Right. So how is Russia reacting to all this talk of potential U.S. intervention, maybe even nuclear options?
Well, Russia has publicly issued what they term dangerous assessments regarding any potential U.S. military intervention against Iran. They're clearly signaling their strong opposition and warning of unpredictable consequences.
Standard Russian rhetoric, perhaps, but still adds to the tension. What about Israel itself? How are they holding up under Iran's strikes?
What seems to be becoming increasingly problematic for Israel is the state of their missile defense stockpiles. Intercepting hundreds of drones and missiles, even with high success rates, consumes a lot of very expensive interceptors, like those used by Iron Dome, David Sling, and the Arrow systems.
Right, defense is costly. And you mentioned Iran's missiles might be getting better.
Yes, there are reports suggesting that some of the Iranian missiles used in recent barrages are becoming more lethal, perhaps more accurate, or carrying larger payloads, or employing countermeasures against defenses. We've seen them hitting targets that cause significant economic disruption, like impacting near the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange and causing that damage to civilian infrastructure we discussed, like at Soroka Hospital.
And some reports drew parallels to Gaza.
Yes, some news reports included descriptions of the damage at Soroka, mentioning scenes similar to what Israel was doing in Gaza, which is obviously a politically charged comparison, but it highlights the visual impact of ballistic missiles hitting urban areas.
Okay, so Israel is under pressure, potentially running low on interceptors. What's the immediate critical implication for Ukraine in all this?
This is perhaps the most direct and damaging ripple effect for Kyiv. The bottom line is, any advanced weapons systems, particularly air defense systems like Patriot missiles and their associated batteries that were potentially earmarked or intended for Ukraine, will now almost certainly be diverted to Israel instead.
Diverted, not just delayed, but actually sent to Israel.
That seems highly likely given the perceived immediate threat to Israel and the U.S. commitment to its security. If Israel needs more Patriots to defend against Iranian missiles, and the U.S. has some available or in the pipeline, Israel will almost certainly get priority over Ukraine right now.
This leaves Ukraine with, what, a massive hole in its air defenses.
A significant and urgent problem, yes. There are even concerns, though unconfirmed, that some Patriot systems currently deployed in Ukraine could potentially be pulled back and redeployed to Israel if the situation there is deemed critical enough by the U.S.
Pulling systems out of Ukraine. That would be devastating for them.
It would be incredibly damaging to their ability to protect their cities and critical infrastructure from Russian missile and drone attacks. It highlights just how vulnerable Ukraine is to these shifts in U.S. strategic priorities.
And you mentioned Netanyahu's tone earlier, being quite strident.
Yes, analyzing Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent public statements, some observers noted his reportedly strong rhetoric, calls for revenge, even described by some sources as screaming in certain calls or meetings.
What's the interpretation of that?
One interpretation is that this intensity might indicate Israel has actually taken a harder hit from Iran's recent attacks than perhaps initially perceived or publicly acknowledged. It could suggest they weren't entirely prepared for the scale, the duration, or perhaps the effectiveness of Iran's response.
So maybe the defense wasn't quite as seamless, or the damage was greater than admitted.
Possibly. And it contrasts with Iran's situation. Iran, having endured the brutal 8-year-long war with Iraq in the 1980s, has a demonstrated capacity, perhaps even a societal resilience, to absorb significant strikes and continue a prolonged fight. They might have a higher pain threshold, politically and socially, than Israel does in this kind of exchange.
That's a sobering thought. And this raises the stakes even higher, doesn't it? Especially with the nuclear facilities involved. What about Dimona?
Right. Adding another layer of extreme danger is Iran's explicitly declared intention to strike Israel's Dimona nuclear reactor complex if the U.S. intervenes militarily against Iran.
Dimona. That's Israel's main, largely undeclared nuclear site where they're believed to produce their own nuclear weapons. Hitting that the consequences would be catastrophic.
Unimaginably severe, yes. A successful strike on Dimona could potentially release significant amounts of radiation, which, depending on wind patterns, could heavily impact not only Israel, but also neighboring countries like Egypt and Jordan.
A regional nuclear disaster.
Potentially. And beyond the immediate radiological impact, such an attack would almost certainly trigger further massive escalation. Iran has also threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Cutting off a huge chunk of the world's oil supply.
Exactly. And they've threatened direct strikes on U.S. military bases throughout the Persian Gulf. We're already seeing some precautionary movements, for example. Reports indicate some non-essential assets are being withdrawn from the massive Al Udeid air base in Qatar, possibly in anticipation of potential Iranian targeting.
So the U.S. is already adjusting its posture in the Gulf.
It appears so. And perhaps most worryingly, there are now reports suggesting Israel has actually begun preliminary evacuation procedures for civilians living in the areas around the Dimona reactor complex.
Evacuating around Dimona. That implies they take the Iranian threat to strike it very seriously.
It certainly seems that way. Taking precautions against a potential Iranian retaliatory strike on their most sensitive nuclear facility, the whole situation is balanced on a knife edge.
It really is. And while all this high-stakes maneuvering is happening in the Middle East, it's absolutely crucial we don't lose sight of the ongoing, brutal reality on the ground in Ukraine. We need to remember how these international crises directly impact that conflict.
Absolutely. The war there hasn't paused just because the tension has shifted.
Not at all. So let's quickly look at the latest battlefield developments in Ukraine, keeping in mind how stretched international attention and resources are becoming. As of the latest reports, around June 17th, Russia launched what was described as one of its largest coordinated drone and missile attacks of the entire war.
One of the largest. What were the numbers?
The figures reported were staggering. Something like 440 drones, mostly Shahid style, launched alongside 32 missiles of various types, primarily targeting Kyiv and other major cities.
440 drones, that's an enormous swarm. What was the damage?
The impact was severe. Reports indicate around 150 residential buildings were damaged just in Kyiv alone. Tragically, the attacks killed at least 28 people across the country, including one American citizen who was confirmed among the dead. Another 134 people were wounded.
Devastating civilian casualties from one wave of attacks.
Absolutely. President Zelensky visited one of the impact sites in Kyiv shortly after, condemning it as a vile attack, specifically targeting civilians.
And you mentioned earlier there's been an uptick in these drone strikes recently.
Yes. Observers have noted a perceptible increase in the frequency and scale of Russian drone strikes into Ukraine, particularly since around January of this year. While the specific reasons are debated, maybe increased production, maybe tactical shifts, this trend does happen to align chronologically with the recent change in the U.S. presidential administration, though a causal link is just speculation.
Interesting correlation, even if the cause is unclear. Okay, moving to the actual front lines, what are the key map updates?
Let's look at two main areas. First, in the southeast, near the city of Pokrovsk. This is a really vital logistics hub for Ukraine and the Donbass. Russia is actively trying to envelop it to cut it off.
A critical battleground, then. How's the fighting there?
Recently, Ukrainian forces, specifically elements from the 36th Separate Marine Brigade, the 54th Mechanized, and the 101st Security Brigades, managed to successfully repel a large-scale Russian daytime armored assault near the town of Konstantinovka, which is on the approaches to Pokrovsk.
A successful defense. How did they do it?
It seems like a well-coordinated defense using a mix of artillery fire, anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs, and critically, numerous FPV drone strikes targeting the advancing Russian vehicles. Footage released after the battle appeared to confirm at least 14 Russian armored vehicles, like tanks and BMPs, and another 6 motorized transport units destroyed or disabled. They also estimated around 50 Russian personnel killed or wounded in that failed assault.
Wow, that's a significant tactical victory for Ukraine. Repelling a major armored push like that is crucial.
It absolutely is a real boost for morale and shows continued effectiveness in that sector, at least in that specific engagement. But the pressure there remains intense.
Okay, what about the other area? You mentioned the north.
Yes, the situation in the north, near the city of Sumy, is quite different and more concerning from the Ukrainian perspective. In recent weeks, we've seen a relatively rapid Russian advance in that border region. They've reportedly occupied about 10 border settlements and are actively advancing in at least 3 more directions.
A rapid advance. Why is Ukraine seemingly struggling more there?
It appears to be a combination of factors creating significant challenges for Ukraine in the Sumy border area. Firstly, some of their more combat-ready brigades had apparently been transferred away from that sector to reinforce other critical fronts, like near Pokrovsk.
So they were potentially undermanned with experienced troops.
That seems to be part of it. Secondly, reports suggest that the defensive structures in that area, many dating back to 2014, were poorly staffed and inadequately equipped. There are also issues with critical roads leading to the rear areas lacking protective measures like anti-drone nets or coverings, making logistics and reinforcement difficult under constant drone threat.
So a combination of troop redeployments and inadequate fortifications and preparations. Sounds like it created an opportunity for Russia.
Precisely. It points to broader systemic issues, perhaps in planning or resource allocation for that specific sector. And Russia is clearly trying to exploit this opportunity. Their goals in this northern push seem quite clear.
What are they trying to achieve near Sumy?
Two main objectives, it seems. First, they want to advance close enough to bring the city of Sumy itself within range of their conventional tube artillery howitzers and mortars. If they achieve that, they can make the city essentially uninhabitable through constant shelling, forcing civilian evacuation, and disrupting it as a regional center.
A brutal tactic, similar to what they've done elsewhere. What's the second goal?
The second, perhaps equally important goal, is to bring Sunni within the effective operational range of their FPV drones for sustained targeting and terror campaigns against the population and infrastructure.
FPV drones. How close are they to achieving that? Is Sumy in range now?
Currently, Sumy City appears to be just outside the typical effective range of most standard Russian FPV drones. The operational range for these kamikaze drones is usually around 15 kilometers, maybe slightly more for some models.
And how far away are the Russian positions?
The nearest Russian forward positions are currently estimated to be about 18 to 20 kilometers from Sumy. Plus, you have to remember, FPV drone launch teams usually operate several kilometers back from the absolute front line for their own safety, say around 5 kilometers.
Okay, so doing the math, 20 kilometers minus 5-kilometer launch distance puts Sumy still outside that 15-kilometer effective radius.
For the most part, yes. Furthermore, FPV drones typically carry smaller explosive payloads compared to shaheds or missiles. While they can still cause damage and casualties, their effectiveness for widespread terror bombing decreases significantly at longer ranges. So for now, Sumy isn't quite within that optimal FPV terror range for Russia, but they are clearly trying to close that gap.
So it's close, but not quite there yet for large-scale FPV attacks on the city itself. These recent events, both the costly attack on Kyiv and the Russian advances near Sumy, really underscore the ongoing severe challenges Ukraine faces, don't they? Especially as global focus and, more importantly, vital resources like air defense systems are increasingly stretched thin by crises elsewhere.
Absolutely. It paints a very difficult picture for Ukraine moving forward. So as we wrap things up today, I think what's become abundantly clear from this deep dive is just the profound and often really surprising interconnectedness of all these global conflicts.
Yeah, it's impossible to look at any one of them in isolation anymore, isn't it?
Completely impossible.
Yeah.
Actions in one theater, like the Middle East, truly have these immediate and often far-reaching consequences in others, like Eastern Europe. It's this incredibly complex, dynamic, and frankly, rapidly evolving tapestry that we're all just trying to understand in real time.
A very unstable tapestry right now, it feels like.
Definitely unstable. And on that note, thinking about everything we've discussed today, this raises a really important, maybe even disturbing question for all of us to consider. Given our discussion of these unconventional tactics, the apparent deliberate targeting of civilians, the confirmed use of indiscriminate cluster munitions in populated areas, and even the unprecedented contemplation of using tactical nuclear weapons as a military option.
Yeah.
What new red lines are truly being drawn? Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, what existing red lines are being erased right now in modern warfare?
Yeah. Are the old rules breaking down? Or being rewritten in dangerous ways?
Exactly. And what does this potential shift, this blurring or erasing of lines, actually mean for the future of global stability? Where does this road lead?
It's a deeply unsettling question, and one without easy answers, unfortunately.
Indeed. It's definitely a question that demands our continued attention and analysis. So to everyone listening, our advice, as always, is stay curious, keep digging, keep asking those questions.
Keep seeking out reliable information.
Absolutely. And remember, the more we all strive to understand these intricate global dynamics, these connections and consequences, the better equipped we might be, collectively and individually, to navigate this increasingly complex world.
Well said. Until next time, keep digging deep.
And please don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive, wherever you get your podcasts for more insights like these. Thanks for tuning in.